If you're a GM, you're going to find yourself kind of always being asked the question, well, I want to do this or I want to do that. And you're going to have to come up with some DCs on the fly sometimes, or as you're preparing for your adventure for the night, you might need to look up some DCs as you're going along. Fortunately, Pathfinder has a really good, complete system for setting DCs, and that's what we're going to go over in this video. My name is Don. I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist, and let's go ahead and get into it. In a lot of cases, the encounters you come across, the traps you come across, maybe there's a treasure, maybe there's a chest, maybe there's things that the players need to do, are already going to have the difficulty classes already assigned. But there are a lot of cases where it's not predefined, or maybe it's a recall knowledge. Maybe the player wants to jump on top of a box in order to look over something, and you need to roll a spontaneous athletics check or acrobatics check. There are plenty of cases in which the difficulty class isn't going to be defined because the module designers or even you in your own homebrew setting can't possibly come up with every possible thing that players can come up with, because you know what? Players are pretty creative. What the rules for Pathfinder give you for setting a DC is they give you a bunch of different things that you can do. Something even as simple as simple DCs. There's also DCs by level, depending on what you're trying to do, as well as adjustments you can make depending on whether they're using just the right skill in order to try to bypass it, or maybe they don't have the correct skills and you need to make something more difficult because they're using something that isn't as well defined. There are also cases where perhaps the group might want to go ahead and make a roll. Only one of them need to succeed, but the group can roll in order to see if they can succeed. And then we get into other things like the proficiencies that a person has and how that affects the DC. Not only the proficiencies that the players have, but the minimum proficiencies that they should have in order to attempt the check. That's well defined, as well as a whole bunch of specific actions that we're not going to go into really, really precise detail, but it does exist within the rule system, and it kind of keeps you from feeling that you're left hanging out to dry. With that, let's go ahead and get into the first category of difficulty classes, and that is a simple DC. For those on-the-fly adjustments and on-the-fly things that occur that a player comes up with, you might need to quickly set a difficulty class. There is a table 10.4, and we'll go ahead and put it up here. And basically what it does, it allows you to select a simple DC from this table by estimating what proficiency rank best matches that task. For example, if someone wants to get on top of a table, you could do that untrained, because pretty much anybody can do that. If someone wants to climb to the top of the bookshelf, that is, let's say it has 9 shelves and is 16 feet above the ground, and they want to be able to stand there on a 18-inch depth counter without falling off, well, that is something that is probably going to be trained. Let me take that back. It's probably going to be expert, but they could potentially do it at trained, maybe with a slightly higher DC. These simple DCs don't take into account those slightly higher things. That's where the DC adjustments, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But by you setting what the minimum proficiency rank should be, it kind of gives you a quick way in order to come up with a difficulty class. And if something is untrained, it's going to have a difficulty class of 10. If something is trained, it's going to have a difficulty class of 15, expert difficulty class of 20, master difficulty class of 30, and legendary difficulty class of 40. As you get to those masters and you get to those legendaries, you're thinking, well, that DC is pretty high. Remember that generally speaking, you're going to be around level 15 before you can hit legendary. So you're going to have a pretty good roll if you are trained in a specific task. Now, simple DCs do kind of reach their limit when you need a DC on the fly and there is a level associated with that particular task. So in this case, you would really use simple DCs for skill checks. There's not much gradation between them, so they don't really work that well for, traps or hazards or haunts and really, really important things where the player character's lives might be on the line. And if that's the case, you want to go to level-based DCs, which is what we're going to cover next. If you are trying to determine the difficulty class for something that does have a level in the description, well, there's a table for that, and we'll go ahead and put it up on the screen. There's always a table for everything, it seems like. What you would want to do is you would try to find the level in the far left column, or the other side, where it continues on from 12 all the way up to level 25, and it will show you what the difficulty class should be for whatever item, skill, hazard, trap, whatever it corresponds to. Then you can go ahead and find out what the DC should be for that level. Now, these are the DCs that you're going to be using when someone tries to identify a spell, recall knowledge about a creature that has a level. The spell might have a level. They might be identifying magic against something that has a level. Even earning income when the income task that they're doing does have a level. You can go ahead and refer to this table in order to quickly come up with DCs. This is available. I know I've seen it on just about every GM screen I've ever seen, but if not, go ahead and print these out, and that way you have them and they're readily available so you aren't flipping through books trying to get at them. And another place where this comes into effect doesn't necessarily even have to be the subsystems that have obstacles, but if there is an obstacle in the way and it has a level, you can go ahead and use these for anything that has a level. As opposed to the simple DC, this does have a lot of gradation between what the difficulty classes are. So if you need something a little bit more precise, or once again, if it does have a level listed in its description, then this would be the table you would want to go to. Now, one thing I will say is at the bottom of this particular table, there is a DC listing for spells. Since spells go through a 1 to 10 scale, you would use whatever spell level in order to determine what the DC was for that particular spell. Now, some examples of when you would use this. There's a really good one in the book, so I'm just going to use that rather than come up with one on my own. But let's say you come across a wall in a dungeon, and there's two ways you could go. You could simply say that someone needs to be a master in order to climb it, and then use a simple DC of 30. Or if you know who made it and that person was a 15th level villain who created that wall in the dungeon, then you would use the DC of 34 because that equates to a 15th level. Either one of those approaches is reasonable. It even says so. It specifically says that sentence in the book. And it does allow you to come up with these fairly quickly, either using simple, which was a little bit lower, or more precisely by level, which gave it a little bit higher. It won't always be higher. Sometimes it might be lower, but usually it's more precise. Now, there are going to be cases where it's not so clear cut. So you might not know the level, or you're not entirely sure if the level actually corresponds to the level of difficulty. Let's say you think the level of difficulty is too high. You can adjust it. Let's say you think the level of difficulty is too low. You can also adjust it. But that is where we get into the next section, which is DC adjustments. Now, you as the GM might decide that the DC should be different from whatever the baseline is, depending on the table. Could be simple DCs, could be DC by level. You could think it's too hard or too easy. There are ways to adjust this that are consistent and will allow you to be consistent at the table so that the player characters are aware, or they feel that it's fair. The DC adjustments, you can think of them this way, and they actually label them this way. They're incredibly easy, very easy, easy, hard, very hard, and incredibly hard. And each one of those are either a negative or a positive adjustment. And we'll go over those in a second. But this adjustment represents basically a difference in the difficulty level of the task and applies to anyone who is attempting a specific check for it. Now, these adjustments happen most commonly when you do a DC by level, and the increments are 2, 5, and 10. And you can also, if you look at the rarity level, it's not going to be for anything easy, very easy, or incredibly easy, because something that's rare probably isn't going to be incredibly easy, but it does give you a hint as to where you might want to put an adjustment to a DC based on whatever they're trying to do, whether it is uncommon, rare, or unique. Now let's kind of go over what the adjustments are. So for incredibly easy, the adjustment is going to be -10. For very easy, the adjustment is going to be -5. For easy, the adjustment would be -2. Hard is going to be +2, and you'd use this for uncommon. Very hard is +5, and that is going to be for rare. And then incredibly hard is +10, and that would be for unique. Now, there is another way to use this, and this is the way that I personally see this used most often. Other people could see it used more often in other ways, but the GMs that I have played with generally tend to do it when you are doing a specific check using possibly the correct skill or possibly the wrong skill. And once again, as opposed to me coming up with my own example, there is a really good example in the book, and it is for Identify Magic. So their example is you have a tome that is 4th level and it has the occult trait. So you set the DC for an occultism check to identify the magic at 19, which is going to be what it should be based on the table for DC by level. However, in Identify Magic, other magic related skills can typically be used at a higher DC. So you might decide that the check is very hard for a character that's using Arcana, which is going to be that +5, and that will be for the characters that are using that skill. And then the example in the book actually goes a little bit further, which I love, where if a character in your group has the aberration lore, you might determine that it would be easy or very easy to use that skill and adjust the DC maybe 1 level down to -2 for an easy, or it could be very easy and take it down to a 14 because you're being more specific. These adjustments aren't meant to take the place of the character's bonuses, modifiers, and penalties. They are just being done simply because of the skills that are being used are either more specific, correct, or less specific or less correct in order to try to overcome the challenge. Now, there are some special cases out there, and the first one we're going to go into are group checks. Group checks are generally when only one person in the party needs to succeed. So let's say that you are trying to push over something that is blocking your way. Now, it could be very hard or incredibly hard in order for you to do that, and the players might have multiple chances to try to do it. But if everybody's rolling at it, there is a more than likely chance that someone is going to roll high enough in order to succeed at the check, because it is very unlikely that everyone is going to roll a nat 1, just as it's unlikely that everyone is going to roll a nat 20. Now, in this particular case, you could do the adjustments if you wanted basically to ensure that they could get it done, but you wanted to make it seem like it was going to be a big thing for the role play, then you don't have to do an adjustment. If you wanted to make it harder, that's when you could do the hard or very hard in order to adjust the DC for that particular group check. Once again, multiple people are rolling, so there is a very good chance that someone will roll high enough in order to overcome it if it is appropriate to the level. And one of the last kind of special things I want to talk about is minimum proficiency. There are some things that your players are going to come across that they just need to have a certain proficiency level to do. A good example for this is if you wanted to pick a lock. The lock just might require that you need to be an expert or a master or even legendary in order to pick it. The person can still try. However, if they don't meet that specific proficiency rank, then they literally just can't succeed, regardless of whether they got a critical roll or not. All that can be homebrewed, and all of it can be basically based on what GM adjustment you would like to make. But by rules as written, I'll actually read it specifically from the text. A character whose proficiency rank is lower than what's listed can attempt the check, but they can't succeed. Now, this is also useful if you just want to make something to ensure that the person is trained. And once again, the book has really good examples for this section, so I am just going to use that for this particular example. And that would be, you might decide that something needs an Arcana check in order to identify this particular arcane theorem. Someone who is trained will be able to do it. However, an untrained barbarian isn't going to be the one that will be able to succeed. So they could roll if they wanted to, but they will not succeed. And then it does give you some guidance as far as maybe by level where you might want that person to be trained in. For example, a 2nd level or lower task should almost never require expert proficiency. So you should just need to be trained in order to get at it. A 6th level or lower task should almost never require master, and a 14th level or lower task should almost never require legendary, simply because the players aren't going to be there yet by the time that they are at that level. Therefore, there's absolutely no way that they could ever succeed. Now let's move on to some specific actions. Once again, I'm not going to go super into these, but I just want to highlight them that they're in the Game Mastery Guide, and they usually use the rules that we've already established so far in this guide as well. Let's go ahead and start out with crafting. Crafting, when a character crafts an item, then you would generally use the item's level to determine the DC and applying whatever adjustments that you would want to make from the DC adjustment table based on the rarity of the item. Or you could also make it easier if the item that they are crafting is a very, very common item. And repairing an item usually just uses the DC of the item's level with absolutely no adjustments, though you could adjust the DC to be more difficult for an item of higher level than the character can craft. For earn income, you would basically set the task level when someone tries to earn the income, and the highest level task available is usually the same as the level of settlement that they are in. And if you don't specifically know the settlement's level, then it would be 1 or 0 to 1 for a village, 2 to 4 for a town, 5 to 7 for a city. They might need to travel to a big city like Absalom or something along some other metropolis or capital in order to find anything that's level 8 through 10. But in that case, you would use the DC by level in order to determine what the DC would be in order for them to accomplish that task in order to earn income. Adjustments could be made. Let's say they were doing something outside and it was bad weather, or heck, even they were inside and it was bad weather and it was dark. So if they were trying to read something or to transcribe something, it made it harder. So there are ways that you can adjust even when you're doing stuff to earn income by level. It recommends for gathering information that you just use a simple DC, and then you can do adjustments if the player characters, while they're gathering, are seeking very, very specific information. So if it's broad and general and you want to select a DC based on the availability of that particular information in a normal town, and if they're getting more and more specific, that's where you would make the adjustments. If you need to identify magic or learn a spell, the DC is going to be the level, and you could make your adjustments based on rarity. If the item is cursed or if it is some type of illusory item, then you could use an incredibly hard DC in order to try to identify that or to learn a spell to increase the chance of misidentification. Recall knowledge, I'm not going to do a whole bunch of recall knowledge. However, recall knowledge is basically going to be based on the skills. If it is about a specific creature, a specific trap, or a specific subject that has a level, use level-based DC. You could adjust the difficulty down if what they're trying to identify is particularly famous or particularly notorious. In other words, more people would know about it or more people would have heard about it. If a character wants to learn additional knowledge based on a recall knowledge, you can adjust the DC higher for each additional attempt as they get more and more specific. Creature identification, you would generally do it by the skill that is used to identify the creature based on that character's traits. For example, if it was a Leshy, then you would use nature. But there is a bunch of leeway depending on what skills that particular creature can use. For example, if it was a hag, hags are humanoids, but they have a strong connection to occult spells and live outside of society. This is an example from the book. So you might allow a character to use occultism to identify him without any DC adjustment, but society could still be used, but it would be much harder because they tend to live outside of society. So it would be basically rumors. Lore skills can also be very useful in order to try to identify these things. And in general, if they are using an applicable lore, then the DC could be made easier. Sensing direction is largely going to be a simple DC if someone uses survival to sense direction. And as far as the simple DC levels, it would be trained DC in normal wilderness, expert in deep forest or undergrowth, master in featureless or a tricky location, and legendary in weird or surreal environments like other planes. For social skills like deception, diplomacy, intimidation, or performance, then you're trying to influence or impress someone, and you don't particularly know their level or will DC, maybe it's homebrew, maybe it's an NPC that isn't specifically listed in a manual, or maybe it's like a servant that you had bring canapes in order to the group that isn't necessarily written in the module. Well, you would estimate what their level is. A commoner is usually level 0 or level 1. You really don't need to worry about being too exact, and it does make sense to adjust the DC based on the target's attitude for deception, diplomacy, or performance. Make the DC easy for a friendly creature, very easy for helpful, hard for an unfriendly one, or very hard for a hostile one. And you can also adjust the DC based on whether that particular NPC in your mind would be willing to naturally do what they are asking them to do. If that person is fundamentally opposed, or you think they would be fundamentally opposed to giving a certain amount of information or doing a specific thing, then you could make the DC level harder. Subsist is pretty much going to be a simple DC with a trained DC for a typical situation, be it a city or be it an environment with scarce resources. You would just have to know kind of what the scarcity of resources would be, either in the urban or wild environment that they're going in. When you're tracking, you're using survival to track. You would basically pick a simple DC and adjust it based on whatever circumstances. For example, multiple creatures in army are going to be super easy to track, whereas a rabbit is going to be very hard to track. There could also be adjustments made depending on weather. Let's say it recently rained and it made the ground all muddy, and therefore the tracks are indistinct. Those would be things that you could do in order to make adjustments. You could also think if the creature they were following used something like cover tracks, then you can make that DC extremely difficult. And then the last action they give for specific actions is to train an animal. And train an animal, it allows the PC, the player characters, to teach an animal tricks, and you would just use the level of the animal as the baseline. And you can adjust the DC if the trick is specifically hard or dangerous, or make it easy depending on the creature's attitude towards the owner. Now, I hope this video on setting DCs was informative for you, and maybe you learned something, or maybe you thought of something a slightly different way. Pathfinder 2nd Edition is very good at kind of explaining what you need to know in order to set DCs. It doesn't leave a lot up to chance, and it really helps a game master out, so much more so than most other systems that I've seen before. But I do hope you liked this video, and if you did, feel free to like, subscribe, or hit that notification bell. But whatever you do, I hope you have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.